mission through talking about his Nazism.
Yeah, I did too.
That
We
was kind of strange to
that's
go into.
low
That was
hanging
like a
fruit.
reference theory,
We're gonna
I thought it
talk
was
about
pretty
that
good.
but
A
that's
stambo
kind of
little
all.
meta in
stretch, but it
itself.
was pretty
Like a
good.
reference to
Right.
reference theory. Yeah, okay.
How useful is that as a tool, Chase?
I don't know until the tool's broken, then I see it.
But then it's
Context of its referentiality or whatever.
So we were gonna talk, at least we talked about talking about section 14 since we didn't talk about it last time. Um, so if, I don't know, we can do that. There are a couple of questions that came up on Discord too, but I don't know. Does anybody want to say anything about section 14, the beginning of chapter 3, the idea of the worldliness of the world?
in the Stambaugh edition. What page is that? Forgive me.
Page 63 and also 63, the in the marginal number, the H number is also page 63, whatever that is in the other translation. So, I mean, the only
Oh,
reason we don't have to talk about it if you want to, but that was, we said, well, we'll start with 14 since we didn't, it was supposed to be something we did last time, but we didn't get
r-
to it last time.
right. That was another forgive me, is that person here? I can't remember who
Tristan, I think, brought it up.
Tristan.
Yeah, who's not here right now. Um, I mean, to me, it just seems like section 14 is just sitting out. Well, the chapter 3 is the worldliness of the world, and then the first section there, number 14, just seems like he's just trying to sketch out a very general notion of different meanings of world, and sort of as an introduction and what he means by worldliness. So
Yeah,
seems like
and I
he's just
think
trying to give us our bearings there.
I think he's trying to distinguish it from like a sort of a Cartesian notion of like it being like space, spatiality or whatever being like the thing we want to focus on, and more like um that there's these different worlds that we're in, like you're in the world of sports or the world of like academia, and that's going to involve different um I guess commitments and whatever he's going to get into later. But it seemed to me, if I'm remembering correctly, that he was trying to just really make a negative case that it's, or drilling in that it's like, it's not like when he's saying world, it's not just here's a bunch of discrete objects in space, and that's all there is to say about what a world is.
And then he also, I mean, at the very bottom of 64 in the Stamball, which is the beginning of page 65, Heidegger number, he gives us the different ways he's going to use the term world, which, I mean, maybe I need to do what Chase did and make a bunch of note cards, because there's all these vocabulary, all these different vocabulary terms. But like when I put the word world in quotes, I mean this. And when I don't put it in quotes, I mean this. And then but it seems like he's also just kind of laying out his technical terminology and the various ways that he's going to use world too. So, which is helpful. It's just I'm going to have to keep coming back or either that or give in and make note cards. Maybe we should just let Chase make note cards, and then when it comes up, he can just stick one in front of the camera. This is what this word means.
I like that idea.
I found interesting going back to, this worldliness of the world and looking at 14 again after, where we finished with today's reading. At least in the Stambaugh's translation, there's this emphasis on a totality, which is already a pretty loaded term in the tradition, totality. And it seems to me that Heidegger is making a point that a world is a totality of beings. And for the kinds of things that are just, not Dasein, that have a categorical existence, there's no such totality of beings for them. but it's for Dasein, right? That we comport ourselves to things or other beings in the world as part of relating to a totality of beings as such, right? And that just kind of sharpening that point about the table doesn't touch the wall. Not like technically there, you could point that there's space between them, but that touching implies a kind of relatedness, as if for the table the wall is part of its world. And Heidegger's, trying to make this point that, like, no, tables don't have worlds. Walls don't have worlds. They can't meet each other in the same world. They don't have worlds. For Dasein, however, we have a world. We operate in a totality of beings, and within which we can draw relationships between a table and a wall, and say they proximately touch.
And then
It,
the sense I got with regard to the totality too, that he was concerned to say that the world is not just the totality in the sense of just the collection of objects, that it's not like a collection of objects, because like worldliness itself is not just the collection of those particular entities. So there's something about the nature of totality as such, about the worldliness, that is not just, like if you just take all the collection of the objects in this room, that does not constitute the world of this room.
Right. I would to sharpen the point. I think for Kant, there's singularity, or single plurality, and then the totality is like a synthesis of singularity. So a plurality, when the plurality of all that is brought into a singularity, that's your totality, and hence a world, right? Bringing all the plurality of everything that exists into a oneness.
So you're suggesting the Heideggerian idea of totality is at least similar to or related to that Kantian notion of totality.
Right. Which is right. I don't even know if Kant really originates that notion of totality, but it shoots through Hegel, Marx, and later thinkers as well.
yeah, because he seems like on 67 when he's talking about like everyday Dasein. This is on 67, third paragraph down. Everyday Dasein already is in this way. For example, in opening the door, I use the door knob. Gaining phenomenological access to the beings thus encountered consists rather in rejecting the interpretive tendencies crowding and accompanying us, which cover over the phenomenon of taking care in general. So it's almost like he's saying like the Cartesian tradition of having subject and object being two separate things isn't applicable here. Like there's the subject and the object are part of the totality of what he is calling Dasein, and how they're particularly used in this temporality of being in us. So I think he's kind of like putting a unification aspect between, almost like unifying subject and object, to saying these are ontologically certain or epistemically certain, but they're not separate beings. They're kind of like tools that are used in a totality of kind of expressing Dasein.
Yeah, and on with that note, it's like I think it's like that they implicate each other. Like, if you're gonna have a doorknob, it's like it implies, a turning of the doorknob, and vice versa. You kind of can't. It's like two sides of the same coin. Um, and yeah, so I don't know. Let other people jump in.
Can someone explain the difference between ontical and ontological? I'm sure he mentions it earlier, but I don't remember exactly what that means, and I'm not sure if I ever actually understood.
Oh, that's easy. Chase?
I'll get trying to find my note card somewhere around here. Oh, here we go. Uh, okay, but so off the top of my head, without really trying to refer to this too much, so ontic has to do with entities or beings. So you've got kind of these particular individual beings, and that's ontic. And then ontological, a little trickier, but that's the structure of existence for yeah, cringe and based, as Hunter is saying. I I agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, so ontological, it's kind of, I mean, I think it's, so this is kind of something that was brought up on Discord was, the a priori and the what is Heidegger's a priori? Well, I think the ontological is kind of one way in which he talks about it as a past perfect, where it's an always already kind of thing. Um, you know, which and he talks about it also as a way of saying that previously this must have been the case in order for this. So it has a kind of conditioning, sort of like Kant's a priori also does, the conditions of possibility. Although it's not necessarily for experience as such, but instead it's kind of these are the structures of existence that allow for the possibility of entities to be encountered as they're encountered, as they show themselves. Trying to stick with the Heideggerian phenomenology terminology, but yeah, that's my short rendition of it.
Thank you. That makes sense.
So particular things are ontic, and then and their relationships are ontic, but then you have ontological, I can't say category, ontological existentials, like being in the world and worldliness and things like that. But those are ontological because they're features of like existential structures of Dasein, as opposed to particular beings in that, in the world. Which are ontic.
Wouldn't but he would be stressing existence, right? When he would be speaking ontologically. Chase?
Yeah, can't hear you very well.
Wouldn't if he's making it when he uses ontological? Can you hear me now?
A little better.
Ontological.
That's better.
Okay. When he uses the term ontological, he's really trying to get at the core of what it means of existence.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Chase, but would he not say that only Dasein exists?
That isn't the quote that he has, that only Dasein exists.
But then you have, so what would he say? What would be the right word to use for beings that are not Dasein?
They're real. I think they're real, but Dasein exists.
Like, is there,
To rephrase, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, Chase, but I want to say ontical is anything that can pertain to beings qua their a being, right? And then ontological is anything that can be said of being with a capital B. So the is of every, judgment implies that either in the case of Dasein existence or in the case of things, present at hand or ready to hand or whatever mode they present themselves, in their being, capital B. So most of what the specific sciences will teach us are ontical facts. But what the study of ontology teaches us is being itself. right? Qua being. And so looked at, when we're thinking about being qua being, we're thinking ontologically. And but
And
when we're doing science, we're thinking we're deducing things about the world ontically.
in the guidebook that I've been sifting through, Magda King, she just has this little sentence. She has a little paragraph on all these like terms. She has paragraphs for like each of these terms. But the one on ontic, she says approximations to ontic are real, concrete, empirical, given, and experience. And she says like a synonym for ontic could be, and let me move slow. The synonym for ontic can be existent, ending with a T, existent, the word to be understood in the traditional sense of real existence, not in Heidegger's special sense. So for Heidegger, existence, I think in his technical sense, would only apply to Dasein. Whereas this thing of like an existent, in the more kind of traditional sense, real, concrete, empirically given, that's the ontic.
Can you is it proper to speak of Dasein in an ontic sense?
Yes.
Like
Can I share a paragraph next?
yes, go ahead.
I would love, because I was reading that and I'm just like, this is fascinating. But it's just a short paragraph, few sentences. But like paired with ontic is existentiel, IELL. And existentiel is approximately parallel to ontic, though with a bit of a restricted meaning, and it applies to Dasein. So it's like Dasein's onticality, if you want to say that. Heidegger uses existential, IELL, primarily to characterize the understanding we each have of our concrete existence, all that belongs to it. For this, the theoretical insight into the a priori existential, IAL, structure of our existence is not in the least necessary. Dasein may have no explicit philosophical understanding of himself, or may interpret his own being as reality. This does not prevent him from having a genuine and profound existential, EL, understanding of himself. Conversely, a philosophical insight does not guarantee that Dasein is existentially, EL, transparent to himself and his concrete existence. So they can almost be like, I guess, like mutually exclusive to an extent, or like not necessarily paired to each other.
Which are the two that are mutually exclusive?
Or so like I can have an existential understanding of like Dasein a priori without that meaning that I have any say. I'm reading existential, EL, as like my ontic, almost like a kind of like, maybe I'm reading that more like as a kind of personal like self knowledge of just like my world. Like that's kind of how I'm reading it. And I might have like an existential ontological understanding of Dasein without really understanding my reality. And conversely, I can also like understand my reality, maybe have a lot of self-awareness without having like an a priori philosophical understanding of Dasein.
What's the source that you're reading that from?
This is Magda King's A Guide to Heidegger's Being in Time. And I guess like this maybe makes me feel like, is this what maybe separates someone like, I'm not really recalling like the whole, I don't think I quite understand what is meant by like existentialism is or is not a humanism. But when I hear Heidegger saying this, it almost seems in contrast to maybe the idea of like, oh, like philosophy or reading this particular kind of philosophy might be therapeutic for me. Whereas I feel like this exact thing is Heidegger saying, like, we are not doing a personal therapy.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, I think he's certain, like, because to the extent that you're trying to, get an ontological understanding, he is trying to get like, an understanding of being, like, and then we just happen to be the ones that are the good candidate to inquire from our perspective or whatever. But it's so in that sense, it's like not a humanism. It's not like we just, yeah, I think you're right on the money with that.
Can you put the secondary source in the chat, Joey, just so I have it as a reference? Thank you. Yeah,
FYI,
it's
the I forgot. Anyway, Chase posted a link to a database of a kind.
ooh, I don't know what Chase posted. Are we being recorded? Like, if there's a resource there, I'm sure it was legitimately placed, so we'll just be
Yeah,
aware of it in Discord.
it's on Discord, so you can go look at that.
Thank you. It almost seems like in programming terms, like he's saying that ontology needs to be restructured, reconfigured, reprogrammed, and he's trying to use phenomenology to do that with how we experience the world and our being in the world. Um, Magna King. I have Michael Gelvin. I don't know if that's a good one to use or not, but
So I thought, when you guys were talking, I was looking at these definitions that Heidegger gives again in section 14, and this is Staumboss 64, also the very end of H64 and the beginning of 65, when he goes through these four different ways he uses the term world. And so the first one, so I'm reading from the Staumboss, world is used as an ontic concept and signifies the totality of beings which can be objectively present within the world. So that gives us a hint as to what ontic means there. The totality of beings which can be objectively present within the world. So it's just like, I guess, a world as a collection of objects. World functions, secondly, as an ontological term and signifies the being of those beings named in one. So like Eric and Chase were saying, the being of those beings is then ontological. Indeed, world can name the region which embraces a multiplicity of beings, like the world of the mathematician. We mean the region of all possible mathematical objects. And then 3, world can be understood in an ontic sense, but not as beings essentially unlike Dasein that can be encountered within a world, which I guess would have been 1, but rather that in which a factical Dasein lives as Dasein. Here the world has a pre-ontological existential meaning, that one that Joey was referring to. So, that helps me understand what that word means. Existential is pre-ontological, that in which Dasein lives. So that world can mean the public world of the we, or one's own and nearest domestic surrounding world. And then finally, it can designate the ontological and existential, not existential, concept of worldliness, the a priori of worldliness in general. So anyway, I thought those 4 points helped me see some of those differences between ontic and ontological.
I was going to, I think, Joe, I was going to push back a little bit, Joey. I think you overstated something there. First, let me tell you where I agree, right? I think Heidegger is very explicit here. Existentialism is not a humanism. And I think you're exactly right to focus on the difference between existential and existential, AL and ELL. And I think also you're right to draw out where Heidegger says that these are dissociated from each other. But you went too far when you said that they were mutually exclusive. Here on page 16, H16 or 16 in the Staumboss, it's right in the middle of the page. But the question remains whether these interpretations were carried out. So he's talking about existential, like the humanist knowledge of who we are and how to be, anthropology, ethics, politics, poetry, biography, holding York's skull in front of you. But the question remains whether these interpretations were carried out in as original and existential manner as their existential originality perhaps merited. The two do not necessarily go together, but they also do not exclude one another. 。
decoupled, sort of like sometimes they're aligned and sometimes not, and it's not like a necessary relationship.
But right, and I think a lot of what he's trying to do here in Being in Time is to kind of bring them into a kind of alignment,
Yeah,
so you can see one through the other.
yeah, I agree with that.
So if I started talking about the world of the philosopher or the world of politics or the world of religion or the world of the Southern Baptists, those are all existential, right?
Being
IELL.
basketball
What's that?
and being a football coach.
Yeah, the world of football.
Yeah, but I mean that's a really good point because like in the world of football, you need football to have it make sense. You need the structure of the game, you need the fans, you need that aspect of it. And again, I think he's leaning towards the fact that the human experience is being in the world, but it's a unitary system of experience. Like you can't disassociate human design from the unitary aspect of being in the world. Like we have our temporality, we have our human existence, and it is tied to this very specific limited moment of expression. They're not, human existence isn't independent of the things. Like for the example of the football that you mentioned, you have to be part of the football game culture environment as a unitary whole for those references to make sense.
Yeah, so and I mean, Bill, I mean, this is a genuine question. I mean, for me, which is, I wonder. I'm not necessarily pushing back on any of it, but it's just is it because you say, I guess I'm not sure if that is existential because like in the list that you had referenced earlier of the four different kinds of ways we use the world under two, he says that the world, uh, this is an ontological use of the word, and it's one in which we could speak of the world of the mathematician. And by that, we mean the region of all possible mathematical objects. So, I mean, is he just choosing mathematics because you're dealing with like, is that math is ontological because it's like, you're, or is it that, could he have said, the football player in its region of all possible, football plays or whatever. I mean, I don't, and I'm genuinely confused as to whether it could be ontological or not. Someone can help clarify that for me.
So
So here's
that example with math, I think he's just using math as an example, and it's nothing to do with math in particular. So I think that would see how this is the number two for definitions of world. World functions as an ontological term and signifies the being of those entities which we have just mentioned. Indeed, world can become a term for any realm which encompasses a multiplicity of entities. For instance, when one talks of the world of a mathematician, world signifies the realm of possible objects of mathematics. So that has to do with these kind of regions of beings, which he talks about in I think it's in the introduction where he talks about, what are sciences doing? What are these empirical sciences? Their object is these different regions, and they cover those multiplicities of objects within that certain region. Physics does that, biology, anthropology. So I think he could have used any of those kind of specific sciences as an example of this number two world example.
but those, I mean, again, I could be wrong here, but it seems to me that one and two go together in that, one is talking about these ontic beings, the totality of beings which can be objectively present within the world. And then world functions as an ontological term and signifies the being of those kinds of beings. And I'm thinking that those could be beings you could describe in terms of categories, like categorical beings. because then when he gets to 3, he says, but then again, world can be understood in an ontic sense, but not as beings, essentially unlike Dasein. So I was reading 1 and 2 as referring to beings unlike Dasein. And then, that would still fit with what Chase was saying, because in those sciences, we don't treat those beings as part of worldliness of Dasein. We treat them as if they were completely independent of us and that we could study them in some sort of abstract, objective way. But then when you get to 2, now you're talking about the world of Dasein. And that kind of world is not the same kind of world of physics or chemistry or mathematics, because those kinds of worlds treat objects as not part of being in the world, but as part of, I mean, I guess they're modes, they're like secondary modes of being in the world, but those are where we try to treat objects as if they were thoroughly objective, independent, like traditional ontology has tried to treat them.
Yeah, like Dasein is part of a larger structure itself.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm thinking, and again, I could be wrong, but I'm thinking 1 and 2 are when you're treating objects as if they're independent of Dasein, even though they're not, but you're treating them that way again, because like in the sciences, you say, well, look, there are these objects of physics that we can treat as just objects of physics that don't have anything to do with me, don't have anything to do with Dasein. They're empirically independent. If all Dasein disappeared, they would still be there, and their character would be the same, and they would have these ontological characteristics, these scientific objects. But then when you get, it seems to me when you get to 3 and 4, he's saying, but then you have this kind of world that Dasein has, which is the world in which Dasein lives. And so then you have this ontic way of Dasein's being, which has these existential characteristics, but then you have the worldliness of that kind of being. So it seems like 1 and 2 go together, these merely ontic beings that have a kind of ontological structure to them. But then you've got Dasein, which is a different kind of being, and its kind of worldliness, which is different from the so-called objective worldliness of those other beings, the beings of the sciences.
So, I mean, my interpretation, which I also might be wrong about, I'm just trying to clarify it for myself, was that like 1 and 3 kind of were both ontic, and then that 2 and 4 were kind of the more, because he says in 2 he says world functions as an ontological term and signifies the being of those beings. So it's like, you're taking this more ontological step from 1, because the being of those beings in 1. So maybe like as a mathematician, you're still discussing ontic concepts, but you're doing it in a kind of an ontological way. So I suppose I saw 1 and 3 as both being ontic, and then 2 and 4 as being ontological. But
I think that's correct. But what I'm suggesting is 1 is the ontic of beings not like Dasein. 3 is ontic of Dasein. 2 is not worldliness, I probably shouldn't say, but is the ontological context of these ontic beings not like Dasein, and worldliness is the ontological character of the world of Dasein.
oh, okay, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And because so for number 2, when he's talking about a world functions as an ontological term and signifies the being of those entities which we have just mentioned. And in number 1, the beings they just mentioned or those entities which can be present at hand within the world. So he's talking about the present at hand, which is exactly what Dasein is not. So I mean, Dasein can be taken to a certain degree as something present at hand, but it that does not refer to Dasein's being or Sein at all.
So then
Put it
going
in,
back to the, I didn't mean to interrupt. Going back to the football thing, like let's say a football coach, it seems like then you could say there's a way in which you could say like the world of the foot, the world of the football player, the world of the football player that is ontological. Like if you mean it that way when you're saying it, is that right? Like,
So I'm wondering
I'm
if you
sorry,
could.
I have to address Eric's shirt. You could have helped us out a little the other day.
Yeah, I know. It
That's all
would
I
have
gotta
been
say about that.
Chase. I'm with you for the rest of the season. Okay. I hate the other two up there. So just so you know, I'm with you in spirit.
Right. I've learned to hate Liverpool much more. I'll just
Oh
say
God.
that.
Oh God. Most of all. Most of all.
Yeah.
So we don't need to. We didn't mean to like hijack the discussion here, but
Yeah. All right, continue onward.
somebody else brought up football coach. Somebody else brought up football coach, and I happen to be wearing this shirt today. So
What was the question before that occurred?
Uh, I don't know, but I have a thought. I I I think we're grasping it. But I just wanted to highlight that for me, what stands out in 3 and 4 is attached to ontic and ontological is existential and existential, which I feel like redirects it towards being like Dasein's world as opposed to like world of present to handness, even world of a mathematician, which is still referring to like things, ontic. Um, I think when we existential world, we're getting like Dasein's world. Maybe it's like his real concrete world, the public we. I'm getting a sense of like there's a kind of like a personal to that sense of it versus the ontologico existential worldhood. Um, I think those words existential and existential are essential and that they kind of like bring it back to Dasein as opposed to making it about things in the world, whether we're talking ontic or ontological, the being of those things or those things themselves.
So here's my guess. My guess is that you could. So, for example, you could talk about the world of football in that first sense. So you have, the world of football is a collection of objects that have, so you've got the football and you've got the field and you've got the goalposts and you've got the uniforms and you've got this collection of things and you can talk about them and you could analyze them, and you could analyze what a football is made of and how it's manufactured. And then, so it seems to me that what you're talking in that first sense of ontic beings, it's a collection of things that you could analyze. But then you have the worldliness of football, which is constituted by these relations between these worldly relations, like the relate. How do I describe that?
Those are categories.
What's that?
So when you talk about ontological things for non-Dasein being, those are the categories. Where for Dasein, it would be when you're talking about ontological characteristics, those are the existentials. So I think what he's talking about for number two is exactly that, the ontological categories.
To run with the analogy, would it not be like football as a game almost is too? Like if we're talking about the relationships there, the rules of the game, is that not number two? Whereas one might be like, what is a football? What is the shape? This is just very present to hand, right? Like it's not even plugged into its reference system.
But isn't I thought it was if someone hands me a rule book, the current rule book of the NFL, that's not football. It's the men pushing and shoving and competing against each other that is football. And my sense is that would be more Heideggerian sense of what is the football. It's not this abstract sense of the a set of rules. It's the actual contest on the field.
I think that's three. That's like the public, the cultural phenomenon of football feels like number three.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that's number three. That has to do with Dasein in the ontic sense, the kind of
Okay.
the concrete ontic Dasein, especially I think that when we get into what is it, the chapter after this, the fourth one, which is about being with others and whatnot, you can see that there's some ontic and ontological stuff going on as well with Dasein. And I think this would be part of that, a kind of Mitsein or being with others in a world in the number three sense,
But someone used the word
pre-ontological
culture.
existential signification.
But someone used the word cultural, and it seems to me the Super Bowl being now a secular holiday in the United States, everybody coming over to someone's house and eating too much and drinking too much, that's the cultural aspect of one particularly important football game. But if I'm watching the Super Bowl with a bunch of friends, and even if it is an event and an interaction with other people, I'm not experiencing the football game as the players are. I mean, I wouldn't say I experienced the football game. I would say I watched the football game. And yes, I
Well,
guess watching is a type of experience, but I would feel very uncomfortable to say I experienced the Super Bowl because I watched it on television.
well,
So
I think part of the, and maybe I forget where this is in the text, but there's a part where he says like there's all these different worlds. So I mean, I would think, maybe I'm wrong here, but I think Heidegger would say something like, well, yeah, there's the world of the spectator, and then there's the world of the player, and there's and these worlds are kind of like co-entangled and like, they cross over each other and like are co-defining. But right, I think so.
Joey or Chase, were you going to say something in response to?
I think I was gonna agree with what Matthew just said.
Yeah, me too. I think another way of thinking about it is so using the football example, that if you take a kind of abstract view, a kind of freeze frame of all the physical things as these present spatial objects and sum them all up, that's world in the first sense, the ontical that's present at hand. And then the second one as ontological, but having to do with present at hand beings, or it's the being of those entities that are not Dasein, that are present at hand. That has to do with a sort of abstract knowledge about them. It kind of takes the vision of the world as this as in the first sense as a present at hand summation of concrete beings, and then kind of has particular fields of knowledge about them. So I think something like a rule book could be something more within the realm of the second world. It may have to do with a kind of textual world that's an extension of this abstract world of football in this second sense. That's its ontological categorical nature, is the rules of the game.
And
And then yeah, the third sense, I think that's kind of that's yeah, the public world, the we world. So that would be not just the players, but also the fans as well. It'd be the whole kind of the referential totality of all of that that makes it something of a totality. Although this is kind of, although I guess so I say that, but then one thing that he usually Heidegger makes the point about is so we're talking about referential totalities and equipment and whatnot. Those that usually refers to beings that are not Dasein. Although there's also this kind of transcendental illusion where we take other Dasein as beings of this type, as equipment. And I'm just using the Macri and Robinson terms because that's what I know better, at least for this chapter. I feel like I've lost people there. Oh well. Am I in my own world?
No, well, I
And
mean,
in what
no,
sense?
I think you make sense. And I'm, but there was one thought I had as you were talking, which was, oh, I guess you're referencing rules and everything, and maybe this might be an area to reemphasize what we were talking about earlier about the ontic and the ontological or the existential and the existential, like being uh not being mutually exclusive necessarily, like in the sense that I remember watching it was some documentary on Heidegger and Dreyfus is in it, and he makes a point about kind of a apropos point, which is where he's talking about sports and then he's talking about like pole vaulting, and he says how like there there's these rules and you could like feel like you could understand the game and the meaning of the game just by reading the rule, and those rules are there, but the rules are there to be interpreted by the Daseins in unique ways. And so, like with pole vaulting, there was like, I don't know much about sports, but he was saying there's like in the history of pole vaulting, there's some guy who comes at it a different way. And when he does the pole vault, he makes his, legs go first and his back go up, and no one else had thought to do that before him. But once he does it, it like changes the game. And we even have that expression like change. You change the game. It's like, but none of the rules change. It's just like how do you use your body in the context of those rules. There's an element of spontaneity, or you see it with music, with like jazz or whatever, where there's like there's a riff that's like it's not like you're breaking the rules of music theory when you're playing jazz. Like they're still functioning, but it's just you're kind of moving around them in a creative, spontaneous way, and bringing new worlds, within the old. It's not like so. That's all to just say. I think like it's easy to kind of maybe oversimplify the world of the rules, like almost in this romantic way, where you're like those are all just we should get rid of rules or something to be truly free. But I think for Heidegger, like rules are a part of the game. Like they're not going anywhere, but you can still operate freely within them or something.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points. I think so. One thing I was thinking about, um, so that makes I think that's a really good way of explaining how the ontic and ontological interact, and also how the ontological has this ability to drift over time, and it's actually something that is historical in some sense, which is so that's going to be something different from the way that I think Schopenhauer and Kant would probably view something like their version of an a priori transcendental, for example, would be something that is timeless because those are the conditions of time. And outside of that, there's no changing these transcendental a priori, where for Heidegger, I think there is something like that. There's a kind of circuit between the ontological structure and then the ontic particular determinations of these things. Although generally will be something like the ontological will be more general and kind of um sustained, I think, as in time, um, where the ontic will be, particular things that have a shorter lifespan. But yeah, I think that's a really key notion that gets into the whole, what exactly is Heidegger going to do with time later? Well, I think it's going to be that there's, distinctions of time going on here that are also ontological and ontic and whatnot.
So what confuses me about that is I can't find the passage, but I think it was last week, when he talked about the world of the primitive peoples. And what I thought he said there is that the ontological was the same, both, in our world and in their world. And I haven't found it yet, but I thought he said in previous historical periods, there's still, for example, Dasein, the fundamental ontological characteristic of Dasein is being in the world, regardless. If you are a Dasein in any time period, in any culture, that's the fundamental structure, ontological structure, is being in the world. Then if you talk about particular worlds, like, so for example, the world of football didn't exist, I don't know, 200 years ago or something, 300. But so that world didn't exist, but nevertheless, every Dasein still had this fundamental structure of being in the world. So I thought some of these, and like worldliness of the world and things of that sort were things that would be a characteristic of every Dasein and every culture and every historical epoch. Is that not correct?
So I think that is by and large correct. Although, so in that passage in particular that you mentioned, where he's talking about, primitive Dasein, he's saying that there is some kind of a change in how the ontological dimension of primitive Dasein, um, how it manifests those ontological characteristics, the existentials, that's different from non-primitive Dasein. Um, I think there is still some kind of, if anything, it's, a difference in how they're actualized. But then I think that definitely there is still something that where he's thinking, at least in this book, that yeah, there is an existential structure, and that's going to be the same. If you're a Dasein, you have this. But historically, how exactly that's going to come about and manifest or actualize itself, that will change historically. There's definitely some tension with that whole topic, the whole issue, especially in this book, because uh, Heidegger will change his opinion on this and go all out with no, being is historical and it changes with history. Being is a kind of change in how it's revealed through these epochs of history. Where here, there's still something more kind of traditionally Kantian, I guess, kind of about it. At least that's my interpretation. I don't know. Maybe Eric.
I'm with you on that, Chase. I'm with you on that. I think this is his project is just, and I think you're exactly right. Like his project is to set up an understanding of being within a particular modern epoch. There is a moment where he does. I think you're right, Nevitt. I think you're right to bring that up because that's the tension. He hasn't fully extricated himself from this. Again, I agree with you too. It's Kantian, Schopenhauerian, idealist idea, version of like ahistorical a priori. He hasn't fully detached from that. He seems to be trying to, but there's still a little thread, and that's that admission there. I think you guys are right on the money. I will say too, though, And you're right, the characterization of Kant in this way is largely correct and accurate, though it's slightly complicated with the essay, What is Enlightenment? Because there's a beginning of a sense of historical consciousness. And then also we can understand Hegel really historicizes consciousness as well. Although I don't, to what extent he goes like Heidegger and situates it within epical movements as fully as later Heidegger does, I think is another question. I want to say Hegel just, I don't know, he straddles the tension a lot, with big, strong legs. And Heidegger is really trying to make the move into a more temporal notion of being.
So does that more temporal notion of, I mean, I don't really want to get into this in detail because since it's outside or since it's after this book, but I'm just curious as to when does that shift pretty much occur like everything after this book? Does he then begin to temporalize being from that point on?
I think it's a little bit afterwards. I would say so he wrote this in 27 or something like that. I think I might be wrong about this, but I think it still was a few years before he started to think quite explicitly about this and talking about the history of being and epochs of being and whatnot.
So there was
Whereas
probably
there's
a
still things
transition.
after being in time where he doesn't have that notion explicitly.
So maybe it kind of gradually shifted over a few years.
Yeah. Which if you hear people, not people, mainly Heidegger scholars or whatever the hell graduate students are, talk about the turning, which I think in German it's like Kira, something like that. But that's usually the shift in Heidegger's thinking that determines the earlier, that's usually associated with being in time, what is metaphysics, and then the later stuff that many people tell you is just completely incomprehensible. And that's the turning is the thing that they talk about is this event where, well, then he starts talking about the event more. But anyways, don't need to get too meta about that. Was Hunter going to say something about Hegel?
Oh my God, no, I'm just joking.
No, I was just gonna, yeah, I said it in the chat. I was just gonna say, I think he takes a really complicated, this is a really infamous question. Is how does truth change through time? How does the truth change over time? And I mean, Aristotle had a really solid, for a while, that was the big one. He was like, look, the sea battle is going to happen or not. He was so confident with that. We ran with that for a long time, but Hegel, I think, takes a really complicated, or it's he spends multiple books trying to work it out, but it's like exactly like Eric said, really strongly, firmly rooted in kind of both sides of this issue, where it's yes, being and the truth itself changes over time. It changes with time, but it can be grasped, it can be apprehended in an absolute sense with insofar as we can use the word eternal in a way that it would have meaning at all. He would say, yeah, it's eternally true. It's like definite. It's absolutely sir. Yes, and that's where absolute knowing. So it's very weird. But that's phenomenology of spirit is the development of that truth through time up to the point wherein Hegel could write that book. But yeah, I see Heidegger as definitely going really strongly into the like historicizing, like the camp of attempting to give a solid ontological basis for the practice of historicizing, which I think, as far as I could tell, it just seems like he believes that there's this, but in his predecessors and the people that he borrows these like certain things from, there was this really important sort of mission enacted, but with really faulty. I want to almost say tools or equipment, but you know, these really faulty means. And so I think that, yeah, if you ask like a diehard, like Hegelian guy, you'd be like, you know, I anticipated Heidegger's move and went further. That's what they always say. They always say is like Hegel actually knew he would do that, and then went even further. That's always the same thing, It's, if you look at the dialectic, but I do think that Heidegger's really trying to, um, he's trying to argue that his position on this argument is, I mean, on this debate is well founded. He's going to great lengths to do that. But that's why I actually had a question about this. I forget what page it was, but he was talking about interpretation. Here it is, actually, on H78. H78, the Heidegger 78, in the Macquarie and Robinson, it's page 108, and I don't know what it is on the other one. But it's H78, and it's at the bottom of this paragraph. And he said this thing, because and now here, so now that I said a little piece on the stuff I know about, here's me revealing what I don't know about or understand at all. And it's hermeneutics and interpretation. I thought I had a grasp of hermeneutics because I read a book by Gadamer like 3 years ago, and I figured that was it. That's all I needed. But there's, I'm running into problems now. Like Nevit said, the holes are getting bigger. So I might need a crash course here. But he talks about interpretation in a way that I guess per my sense of Heidegger's MO, it seemed like interpretation was that. It was kind of one of the driving elements of the investigation, of the ontological investigation of the meaning of being. But then at the very end here, and maybe this is just, two things can be true at the same time. Maybe that's all it is. But he says, these phenomena can easily be formalized because of their formal relation to formal relational character. He's just talking about relation and reference, which was whatever. We find it especially tempting nowadays to take such a relation as a clue for subjecting every entity to a kind of interpretation, which always fits, because at bottom it says nothing, no more than the facile schema of content and form. And up next to that, I just put a question mark. I guess I felt like I almost got it when I was thinking it through, because I understood what I could understand his reference to the facile schema of content and form. That's Hegel would agree that, yeah, that's that dichotomy is a false dichotomy. That opposition is a false opposition. They're not actually content and form. That's a facile schema. I guess I can understand that, but his description of interpretation, I don't understand, and I want to know if anybody knows how that fits in with his other descriptions of interpretation. And it's because it seems like he talked favorably of interpretation, but maybe he's just talking here about like, hey, interpretation's good, but don't go too far. Yeah, and right, I'm right there with you, Nevin. It's a big question mark. I don't know, but yeah.
I'm wondering, and again, it really is just a question, if he would follow Nietzsche in saying that everything is interpretation, but that there are better and worse interpretations, maybe. But I'm not sure, because he seems to call he uses the word interpretation as in his own descriptions of things, like this interpretation, and then he will talk about it, and then there that in that part you read, he puts it in quotations. So anyway, I guess that's just a long way of saying I'm confused too.
Are there different German words for it with the quotations and the capital letter versus lowercase? I'm just recalling in some of the Macquarie and Robinson, they make notes about like when we capitalize something, we may mean it differently than not capitalize. And at least in this version, interpretation in that paragraph is capitalized. Just wondering if anybody's recalling or more familiar.
I think I remember the interpretation with the capital I has to do with a specifically ontological interpretation. So when it's an interpretation of the being of beings, then that's the capital I interpretation. And I think what he's doing in this section, or this kind of the part that Hunter just read, is he's talking shit about a particular interpretation, or interpretation, just one, but which is so general that it's not really saying much at all, which is a pretty common way of critiquing something, I guess. So yeah, he definitely thinks that interpretation, is that's what is involved in understanding ontology, and but then yeah, there's bad interpretations still, where there'd be saying that this is, and he has to, the thing in particular is something about relations and signs. He's saying that, okay, if everything can be called a relation, then you're not really saying much at all, because there's no nuance or distinction going on there. Like I can say, I interpret that the being of all beings is uh balloons, or tutti frutti, the flavor, or just make up whatever and be like, well, everything has this. That's why you can't see it. It's so general that it's just completely like, okay, cool, who cares? Um, I think that's what he's critiquing something seemingly probably some actual historical position about relations and signs indicating. I don't know. That was something that Husserl talked quite a bit about, but I don't know the specifics of it. So I don't know if he's saying that about Husserl. That would be kind of interesting. Uh, but yeah, that's my interpretation of it.
I'm not 100% sure about this. I mean, I'm not 100% sure about anything, but I mean, I'm inclined to say, like, what he's taking issue with here specifically, when he, in the sentence in the Stamball, we are especially inclined today to subject all beings to an interpretation, which I want to say, just following off what you said there, Chase, I want to say he's probably not taking an issue with Husserl, unless Husserl fell down relative to his stated aims of letting the things appear themselves, going to the things themselves, rather than subjecting things to interpretations, or covering up with preconceived notions or whatever. But his whole project of phenomenology, as he describes it at the beginning, right, is allowing the things to present themselves in their being, not as we wish them, not as we color them with our preconceived notions, but as it already is, to kind of like do that whole epiche move or whatever, and to allow things to present themselves. Does that make sense?
So would he call that? I mean, does that involve? Again, I'm not. I don't really understand how he uses the word interpretation in a positive sense. So when you allow things to show themselves as they are, is that involving some kind of interpretation, or is that just?
Oh, it seems like on one level he's really just he's taking issue with the proclivity to interpret things according to a schema, already, form and content, okay, we know how to interpret poems, boom, boom, boom. Instead of just sitting down and letting the poem speak to you, you already have a schema that you're applying to poems in general, rather than just reading this one poem, because it may be sui generis, and you're not even going to see it in its unique characteristics, right? Because you think you know how to read poems. Which is not to say that this reading of this one poem in its sui generis qualities isn't a type of an interpretation. I think there's a level at which Heidegger is saying, like, yeah, there's interpretation. I'm doing interpretation here. But what he's taking issue here with is a kind of predominant ethos of interpreting that is a kind of like automatic response. And I want to say it's related in a sense to where Like this whole book, he's talking about, practical being in the world, being prior to theory. But at the same time, what's he doing? He's giving us a theory, right? And I don't think he's a fool. He knows exactly what he's doing, right? He's giving us a theory which privileges practical being in the world and says theory ain't the main thing. You know what I mean? And there's nothing inconsistent about that. In the same way, I don't think there's anything inconsistent about him saying, that I'm interpreting being in this way, and then we need to open up being to a new kind of interpretation or a more authentic mode of interpretation. And then in this mode, he's going to attack this automatic response to interpret the world according to a schema of form and content. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, building off that, like when I read that text or that portion that we're discussing, to me it seems like the scare quotes is sort of like, him kind of having this big dick energy of like, these people, like in a way, it's like it's these other people he's discrediting. It's like they're it's not that they're not giving an interpretation, but it's like it's an interpretation that's so um uh um it's almost like an lowest common denominator interpretation where it's like, okay, cool, you've like discussed this relationship between the basis of their formal relational character, and it's like empty, and it's not actually getting us at. You're not allowing yourself, when you assume that that's the only kind of interpretation that you can generate, to get into this other kind of phenomenological mode of relating to the content at hand. Because and maybe I'm wrong about this, but it almost seems like maybe that would be like, you're getting into the like a they self or whatever, like kind of way of approaching this stuff, like where you're not actually engaging in it, in terms of uh, relating to it from some deeper part of your own Dasein or something like this. Maybe I'm being too speculative when I say that, but maybe that's a way to read it.
So here's a question. Is this the right way to use interpretation according to Heidegger's way? So you can have an interpretation of being according to sort of a traditional ontology where you treat the world as a whole bunch of independent objects, and you can analyze them as substances and describe their characteristics. So that is an interpretation. But then you can have another interpretation, one I'm thinking that Heidegger would promote, which says, let things show themselves as they are, and use that as the beginning. And that's still an interpretation, but maybe maybe you could say it's better, or it's better in the sense that it's more primordial, so that he can show, like he claims he shows, for example, that the interpretation of beings as just objects, independent objects in a world, is actually derived from a more primary interpretation of beings as things as these referential contexts of worlds. And so maybe he's saying, yeah, that's still an interpretation, but I can show you that interpretation is more primary, in the sense of you can't derive that interpretation from this older ontological interpretation, but you can do it the other way around. You can derive the older one from this one. So, I mean, does that sound right? He would say he's still offering an interpretation, but he thinks it has a certain kind of primordiality or primariness that the previous interpretations do not have.
I think that's consistent with the whole thrust of his being in time project.
Yeah, I think that's right in the sense of kind of how he's interacting with these prior interpretations or whatnot. Although I think still with interpretation, there's something kind of additional that um I think it has to do with something about kind of a more explicit way of making something known. So not only is it, I think it's an interpretation of something ontological, I believe, but also in this kind of explicit conceptual manner. At least that's the way he's going to talk about his own project of being an interpretation also of being in the context of the question of being, that he's talking about the meaning of being, and that itself is an interpretation of being with a capital I. And he's saying that, yeah, we have this preconceptual, pre-ontological, pre-phenomenological access to being, but what is philosophy doing? What the hell is this book? The book is an attempt to give a kind of explicit conceptual interpretation of the meaning of being, even if he doesn't quite get there. But I think yeah, like Eric was saying, he knows what he's doing in the sense of talking about a theory, and he'll make a so he says explicitly that yes, this is a way to try to conceptualize something that has eluded conceptualization until now. I'm going to attempt to do it. But, and how is this possible? Well, it's possible because we already have a preconceptual tacit access or understanding of it in some way. So my task is to make it explicit, conceptual, and that's an interpretation.
Oh, makes sense. Should we talk about Zuhandenheit and what's the other one? Vorhandenheit? Because like Chase was saying, these two translations translate those terms differently.
I think I'd say this right now. I think the Stom Stombog, what the how do you even say that name? Am I even saying that right?
Stambow.
Stambow?
That's what we've been
Okay.
calling.
Yeah, I don't really know. I don't but
She's
the translations in that one I think are really bad. I do not like them. I don't know if it's just like a personal, I don't so what in the Macquarie is ready to hand is handiness in Stambow, and I don't like that at all. Also, equipment becomes useful thing. That is terrible. And what's the other? So the present at hand is, I think objective presence is the most common one. That one's okay. That's a decent translation. But I kind of like the way that the Macri and Robinson, it has these weird terms that, if you start talking like this in public, you're gonna, get locked up or whatnot. But it shows that there's a technical term going on here, where I think so the standby tries to put it into a more readable format that you can read, like, oh yeah, this is useful thing, handy, present, objective presence. These are all pretty normal English words for the most part. I see what they're trying to do, but I think Heidegger should stay weird. It should be something like readiness to hand. What the hell is that? I don't know. I think you need that experience of what the hellness for reading Heidegger. So that's my interpretation. I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, those because I'm reading the Stambaugh too, and to the extent that I've read like excerpts of Being in Time in the past, it's always been the other one. So I'm also like as I'm reading it, like trying to, in my mind, translate like and it's kind of throws me off. Um, Although I could see maybe an argument that like from what I and I don't speak German, I don't know, but from what I understand, like he's often using terms that are kind of like normal colloquial phrases and then using them in weird ways that like work if you understand German, but then when you translate to English, I don't know if that applies to the ready to hand stuff though, so maybe not. But I can see like the idea of trying to take like handiness and then use it in a different way and that like make you want to rethink how you think of handy. But at any rate, I think that this part's really interesting to me and like part of and I don't know enough about Kant. And so from what Eric said, it seems like a lot of this can be derived from Kant. But like to me, it like when I first started getting into Heidegger, um, like I think that his what he's doing here is interesting where you know the approach is to look at like with the hammer, it's like when we're using the hammer we're not conscious of it because it's just working. Like it's just we're these beings that have to build a house or like do whatever, build a temple of worship or something. And so we're using a hammer for that, and we're not even conscious of it until it breaks, and like that's when we're aware of it. So it's this interesting, at least to me, this interesting reversal of how you typically think of philosophy as like as if we're starting from he's starting as us being the situated beings in the world, dealing with the world. And also, this is something I wanted to bring up as a question, like to people who might be more aware of it. Like, I'm curious, like the parallels and dissimilarities to pragmatism, because like I was reading this one book, I don't even remember the author, but he was making an argument that he was saying that Heidegger had been exposed to pragmatism at certain points and that he liked aspects of it and disliked other aspects of it. And there, just the whole kind of emphasis on praxis and like being engaged in the world, there is a similarity, but there's also this tension. So maybe that might be an area that's interesting to discuss.
And this is one of the things that I find most compelling is he does actually seem to describe the way I engage with the world. When I'm like I've been, drinking stuff out of this cup, and I haven't been thinking about the cup at all. I've just been, there it is. I mean, I just don't think about it. And that does seem to be the more direct way I interact with worldly things is I don't think about them as things at all. I don't even think about them. They're just things that, they're just they're almost like extensions of my body. Or think about, like when I'm driving my car, it really does kind of feel like an extension of my body. I'm not thinking about the car, and I'm sure not thinking about, I wonder how exactly they linked the steering wheel to the drivetrain. I wonder if there's an electric actuator there or if it's I mean, I'm not thinking about any of that stuff. I'm just, and I don't know if you've ever, I play this game sometimes when I'm coming home where my street has a double yellow line down the middle of it with little reflectors on it. And I sometimes try to get my right side wheels to travel down right between the yellow lines, I don't know why, just for fun. But it kind of feels like the car is an extension of me. And you kind of, after a while you drive a car, where the bumper is, how close you can get to the curb because it's just kind of part of your, almost like your body. And so again, that's one thing it seems compelling about his account is that it really is the way I interact with things most of the time, not as, objects that have properties, but just as, things that I use to do things in the world to get along with that I don't even think about. And that's all. I can never keep those two terms straight. That's ready to hand, right? Is that correct? Ready to hand is when they're just like things that you're using without really thinking about it.
They're handy.
The car example is a good one also, just to like in the sense of like when you first learn to use a car, you're thinking about every single aspect of it. because you've never driven one before, and your dad's in the like passenger seat like yelling at you, and it's just like ah, and like, but then once you get used to all the background things and not just the car, but like like all these subtle things you have to learn about, like okay, you can't turn right, or you can turn right on a red, but you got to like there's and then you don't think about it at all. You just get in the car and all of a sudden you're somewhere else and you haven't thought about every micro little routine and stuff.
So this particular topic with the ready to hand as kind of primordial over the present at hand, this is the topic that was somewhat prescient in terms of uh, some trends that appeared a little bit afterwards in cognitive science and artificial intelligence, where before it was taking a very cognitive approach to just cognition in general that saw it as some, and then that was applied to artificial intelligence, and the results were not so good. And that it was trying to give these kind of, I mean, I'm certainly no expert in anything to do with artificial intelligence, so excuse my terrible description, but it was trying to give more of a explicit kind of mapping of things as present at hand to artificial intelligence and say, okay, go maneuver around in the world with that. And it just couldn't do it. Especially, okay, think of in terms of robots and whatnot. Trying to get a robot to even stand up and not fall over was extremely difficult. And it wasn't until things like neural nets came in that had a kind of function of bypassing the kind of explicit interpretive layer of things and kind of going as a trial and error kind of self-correcting model. And I think that's when artificial intelligence massively improved that. And that shows also kind of ready to hand nature of things, that you don't go through this medium of I need to measure the spatial distance of these things, and every time it's just like this, then I'll do this mechanism. Instead, it's something that is, well, I don't know, it's more felt. I don't know. It's not something that is explicit cognitive kind of conceptualization aspect to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, tying in with that, I mean, for one thing, I think like I had read or so, like Dreyfus, I think got in a kind of battle with, like, I think he was at MIT for a while, and he was like, that was his argument against the people trying to do that, that he was like, you're not going to be able to do this. Like, and I don't know, and from he's like, I don't know shit about like, computers and stuff or like programming, but I just know as a Heideggerian that like your entire premise is like not going to work because there's no way you can program all these micro, like these very subtle things that human Dasein has, which is like this sensitivity to the world that we're kind of like born into, of that's not, at least in the Heideggerian framing, like not this like if this then that kind of equation. It's it's more sensitive than that. And so I was going to say something else related to that, which is that when we're, well, I'll let someone else talk because now I've lost my train of thought.
I made a comment about this on Discord, but I noticed in this section he uses the term in itself and being in itself, numerous times, and normally he uses those terms like when he's talking about, I guess, ready to hand. that the nature of their being is being in itself as their ready to hand being. But I'm wondering if he is like, is he using that? Is he? I mean, he knows Kant very, very well, and Hegel. And one of my problems is I don't really understand how Hegel uses those terms. But I'm wondering, is he trying to? What is he trying to? Is he trying to say something about Kant's notion of the in itself or Hegel's notion of the in itself by using those terms? Is he saying something like, well, those guys didn't really understand what that meant. And here's what I'm telling you. What it actually means is that this form of being was undisclosed. And what they thought the in itself was, which is the inaccessible being of not being, but the inaccessible, the beyond the boundary of experience, what it is, that really they just didn't realize that it was inaccessible because it was ready to hand. I mean, is he saying something like that, or is it just? I'm just curious. What does he mean by that term? Is he trying to draw on some sort of Kantian or Hegelian notion or reform it?
I think I can give my take at it pretty quickly. So
I think what he's doing is he's not so much disputing the in itself as Kant or Hegel would use it, but he's, as a kind of a category or a concept. Instead, it's more kind of the content of what actually is the in itself. That's what he's disputing, because he's saying that the in itself is the ready to hand of equipment. So he's saying this kind of non-conceptual dimension of our being in the world, of just being among these useful things and doing stuff without thinking explicitly about it, that's the in itself of equipment, of useful things, which is obviously very different from what Kant is saying about the in itself, like completely different. And I'm not sure about Hegel. I'm not going to even comment on that, but I mean, I think for Hegel, the in itself is, I know this is an oversimplification, but it's kind of like that's more like objectivity or whatnot. And then the for itself is kind of like subjectivity more so. Yeah, I shouldn't have even said that. But yeah, that's my take on it.
So the reason I'll go ahead, Eric. Go ahead. Shoot.
Well, I'm trying to find the page. And I'll say this much. I agree with you entirely, Chase. He's not talking about Kant's being in itself. He doesn't even seem to be explicitly disputing it. He just seems to be taking his term and using it in a completely different way. And I'm looking for it here in the Science of Logic. But Hegel, I want to say Hegel doesn't explicitly dispute Kant's being in itself either, or things in itself. Here in the Science of Logic, for Kant, it's the ding, I'm sick, right? The thing in itself. Hegel, it becomes being in itself, which becomes a moment in the development of the notion, but a moment to be passed through as a notion develops itself out of itself. So for Kant, it's like a limit point, for knowledge. For Hegel, it's a moment in the notion, in the self-development of the notion to be passed through. And then for Heidegger, it's something very different, right? I'm just going to put this down too, like the way Heidegger treats it, because we have this inheritance from the tradition, I want to say it borders on dangerous.
Borders on what?
Dangerous.
Well, here's the possible connection I was making with Kant, which again could be completely wrong. So if I think about, like things that are ready to hand, things that are embedded in this context of equipment and usefulness, that I never explicitly think about because I'm just using them. That it seems like that kind of being and that kind of, if that's, the being in itself of those things really is kind of inaccessible to me because I'm just using them. I'm engaging with them, but I'm not reflecting on them. But as soon as I reflect on them, I'm no longer engaged with them in their primordial beingness. So it seems to me that the being in itself, even in a Heideggerian term, is kind of inaccessible because it's what the thing is in its context of usefulness as I'm using it, and it's not that kind of being is not accessible to reflective judgment, reflective awareness, because soon as you engage with reflective awareness, you've broken out of that context, and now you're looking at this thing as, oh, this is a cup. And so the parallel I was wondering is if maybe it's like Kant in the sense that the being of ready to hand things is not, I mean, it is in a way, it is kind of inaccessible, the being of that, because if by accessible, yeah, I mean something that I can cognitively grasp. And so that's why I was wondering if maybe he was saying to Kant, you think that there is this noumena that is beyond the possibility of experience. Well, yeah, kind of, but it's not a noumena. It's just the reason it's beyond, beyond our analytical understanding is because that kind of being is always obscured. It's always hidden from us because it's embedded in this context of usefulness. So yeah, you can't get at that cognitively and reflectively, but not because it somehow transcends experience or something, but because you just can't reflect on things that are embedded in this context of usefulness. That's what I was wondering.
I'll just add one. I don't know. I mean, like, not to. I think like the way I interpret this stuff. So, and I'm not bringing content to that question, but just taking Heidegger on his own terms. I I think for me when I'm trying to make sense of it, I associate it with like the arts and music, or like stand-up comedy is a good example, but either of them. But like if you become like, let's say a stand-up comedian who's like now suddenly becoming self-conscious of their act is suddenly going to get like calculating on everything they're saying compared to just doing the thing, and then there is a recognition like, oh, this is working, but that's based off the laugh, the laughing of the crowd. So it's not something I'm calculating kind of like from this Cartesian spot. I'm already in the world. I'm in a nightclub, to use this example, or whatever, and I'm telling the joke and it's working. And I don't need to, like, if I'm a comedian in this context, like to step back and wonder, is it working? To the extent that I'm doing that, I'm actually getting more in my head and maybe getting thrown off. Or similarly with like music, like and with music, you have to learn the instrument. There's this whole period where it's ready at hand, and then there's a point where you can actually perform in a kind of organic, real way, and it's like you lose yourself in the music and all that, whatever, maybe some hip like wake the Grateful Dead or whatever, you're just you're no longer there, it's just the music, all this kind of thing. I think, like, to me at least, that's how I interpret what Heidegger is getting at with this stuff. And then in terms of how that relates to Kant, that's someone else's thing to get into.
So I'm agreeing with what you're saying here, Nevitt. The way he characterized it, this in itselfness of the things as ready to hand, it seems to be something that is like a bubble that is ruptured as soon as you reflect. The moment of reflection just destroys the thing that you're trying to conceive, which is part of why I find that dangerous, right? That's I guess another rabbit hole. But it's explicitly not a Kantian thing in itself, because for Kant, the thing in itself is the thing conceived sub specie eternitatis, which is, again, against the background of metaphysical, speculation. What does this look like apart from my distinctly human, finite, imperfect way of viewing the things. If I had perfect cognition, then what would it look like to me? You know, if I wasn't, if my knowledge of things wasn't mediated by these senses, these sense organs, this body that I have, what would it look like? You know what I mean? Insofar as we can make sense of look like, you know, without eyes, right? But subspecie aeternitatis. And for Kant, he's like, take that off. You don't know anything. None of us can know anything about what a thing would look like, subspecie aeternitatis. Forget about trying to do that, right? We can only know the world from our finitude, which I think, again, Heidegger's building on, right? But as far as taking the concept of thing in itself, he's doing something very different from Kant there.
Maybe it's because I'm going backwards chronologically speaking. I mean, I read later Heidegger some years ago. But it seems to me that what he's trying to get at is, once you start talking about subject and object, you in effect are talking more about the subject than the object. And then once you talk about perception, you're not talking about the thing in and of itself, but you're talking more about the perceiver, not the perceived. And there's always going to be definite limitations to that and barriers to any understanding of the thing in itself. So don't do that, because it's already a dead end. You may learn so much about the perceivers and perceptions, but that's still not dealing with the thing in itself.
I would need more, because the way that is set up seems like a pre-Kantian metaphysics.
I'm still not. I still don't really know how Heidegger thinks of subject and object. That for me is a big question mark at the moment.
Okay. I've got a first off, y'all can hear me. Okay. Yeah. I guess, yeah, on the subject object thing. Okay, well, and this is, I mean, I'm like partly pivoting to another thing that Eric said that I was interested in as well. And the subject object thing is another thing, because I remember I missed the first meeting, and I saw in the Discord, it was like, oh, you know, it's not, the dot sign's not a subject. Rah rah, kick him in the dishpan. The dot sign's not a subject. You know, that's the rally cry. And I was like, all right, let's, you know. And I did miss the first meeting, and I kind of was like, oh well, I didn't really catch that part, so I just assumed that maybe we covered it. But I guess if we haven't, yeah, is my sense, and this is so surface level. This is extremely surface level. My sense is, I know Hegel's not a coherentist. He does not conceive of a subject standing apart from a world which he observes, which that subject observes and judges and etc. Observe, you know, a distance from it, separate from it. That subject is a part of that world, and they're subject to the same dialectic. Is Heidegger not, I would imagine Heidegger's not a coherentist either. I would imagine Heidegger seems, I don't know, constantly talking about this embeddedness and this embodiedness and this there and this in and this, you know what I mean? Such that it seems like he's resisting the impulse to extricate the Dasein, which, you know, if we can, you know, inappropriately label it a subject, the Dasein, he's very much emphasizing all the time how intertwined it is with its world, and how it is its world almost, and it's spreading itself all over its world, with concern. So yeah. What do you guys think?
I don't
tend
know.
to think that, yeah, like that he thinks subject and object are united, especially when he goes into the properties of things of like readiness at hand. Like we tend to think like when I use like when Nevitt was bringing the example of like a water bottle or a cup that he's holding, I don't really think of the physical properties of this object. I just use it. It's almost like, again, a pragmatic view to objects or what he considers like readiness or how we can use them as tools. But he seems to be saying subject and object are inherently intertwined is one and the same, just different modes. And the object doesn't contain Dasein, but Dasein is part of a larger structure that contains the object.
Yeah, I mean, and the example I used before, the stand-up comedian, like I keep going back to that in my mind because I mean, and that's a special case because it's like it's a DOS sign amongst a bunch of other DOS signs, and so there's this kind of interesting, there it's an intersubjective experience, but still, I mean, the point there is it's like how if I'm going up and I'm trying to do a tight five and I've never done stand-up comedy before, how I like interpret myself in that moment really has little to no bearing on the kind of objective like situation. It's like it's co involved and co-defined by other signs experience of me. It's negotiated like such that this notion of like so but that's like an act like it's an experience I'm having in the world of being on stage in front of people and but there's a kind of objective analysis in a certain sense that's like did that person they have terms for it. It's like did you kill or did you choke or whatever and like that's not up to subjectivity in a certain sense, but it's also not just like your own kind of pure force of your will can determine that what the status of that objective situation is. It's co-involved with other DOS signs. That's an easy case to bring up when it's all these DOS signs. I'm wondering how that relates to, other non-DOS sign entities we might encounter. But I feel like Heidegger would go all the way with it that the subject and object line is not this rigid thing, that there's some kind of interpenetration between the two.
And I want to say that the whole subject object consciousness thing is derivative. That the primary whatever is being in the world, not being conscious of a world, not even consciousness, but so there's this tendency, maybe I don't know, maybe since Descartes, but to think that consciousness is primary and then being is like something that consciousness encounters or something like that. But it's like he's trying to flip that script and say, no, the primary way we are in the world is being in the world. We're being in the world. It's an ontological, ontology is primary. And then you can have these derivative modes of, like subject experiencing objects and stuff, but the subject is not primary.
Yeah, that's what I get as well.
So like ever, Husserl saying things like there is only a world for a subject, for a conscious subject. So it makes no sense to talk about a world if you don't have a subject experiencing the world, because the world can only exist for beings like us who can experience a world. But that seems to privilege the subject in a way that I think, and again, I think Heidegger seems to be trying to flipping it around, going, no, first you're in a world. It's not like there is a world for a subject. You're in a world. Here you are in a world. In a world.
I think he does incorporate.
Okay, so that kind of, the Schopenhauerian, it makes no sense to talk about objects without a subject. So Heidegger, I think he understands that there is something to that, and he kind of incorporates that in that Dasein is being in the world, and that, there's no world without Dasein there kind of worlding it. At the same time, there's no Dasein without there also being a world. So it's kind of like a Mobius strip kind of topology of inner outer kind of twisting in each other, and that kind of holistic structure of world Dasein together. That's kind of what he's getting at. And he's saying if you break that up along the division of subject object, then you're screwing it up, especially if you take that as your starting point. But, later down the line, then maybe we could talk about some things being subject and object in some manner, but he's going to qualify it, pretty massively. Where that's the president hand thing is kind of his version of, you know, objectivity from a sort of naive point of view, or even somewhat like a scientific point of view to a certain degree. Where he's obviously talking about president hand is not everything. It's definitely something that appears, in okay, so for the ready to hand, you've got these occasional interruptions, and at that point, then something president hand can appear. I'm hammering with my hammer, or take Matthew's example, like the musician. Like all of a sudden, I'm playing my guitar, all of a sudden it starts sounding shitty. I look down, and there's, 5 strings missing. Then it's suddenly my guitar is very much present at hand. And that's what he's saying. Okay, there's your object for you. It's at that mode that it appears, although it's pretty complicated at the same time, because it's something that, well, at the same time, it always had that potential of being something interpreted as present at hand, kind of indefinitely, permanently. So that's kind of the thing that gets people, and why you could have that kind of scientific objectivity sort of point of view that discounts anything else other than its determination of the subject. But then even that's kind of well, first of all, yeah, this is something that you were just talking about. It's kind of, well, even that idea of object, you think about what is Kant doing with his transcendental subjectivity and whatnot. He's doing that in order to determine empirical objects. So yeah, I think Heidegger understands that aspect of it, and he's trying to kind of incorporate it, but at the same time, really overthrow the whole distinction, and then show eventually how it's kind of this epiphenomenal secondary derivative kind of thing.
Yeah, so shifting from, so the way I think about it, for Husserl and I guess Kant, you cannot, well, like the intentionality thesis, right, with Husserl, you can't have a subject without an object. So consciousness is always conscious of something, but then it seems like Heidegger's version of that is Dasein is always in a world. There is always
exactly.
Dasein in a world, but it's not primarily about consciousness of, it's being in a world. So
and I think maybe also it would be the other side as well, where it's like a world is always, populated by Daseins. Like, that's there's not one without the other. Like they're equally significant,
Well, one might be tempted to say it's a kind of dialectical relationship. I don't know. I knew that would get Hunter.
Me, whenever I see two things next to each other. Oh. Anyway.
I'm gonna go to bed. I'm tired.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we did a pretty freaking good job, fellas.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Likewise.
Hasta next week, whatever that is in Spanish.
Yeah, actually, I'll see some of y'all 2 days from now later.
Same
That's
bat
true.
time, same bat channel, same Heidegger channel.
Yes, sir. Later.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Leave.